I've been lucky enough to spend a significant amount of time behind the wheel of the McLaren GT, testing the car in the south of France and against the Bentley Continental GT on the Isle of Wight. But in amongst that, I also had a couple of spare moments to collect my thoughts on what the car's like to live with as a daily here in the UK.
Here's a little news flash for you. So whenever you go on a car launch, car manufacturers quite often like to hold these launches in exotic, far-flung locations that allow their cars to shine in the best possible light. So for example, when I drove the McLaren GT for the first time, I drove it in the south of France. However, what tends to happen is that when you drive cars like this in those locations, it can kind of mess with your head a little bit. It can make you think you're in a nicer car than you actually are because of the surroundings and the way everything is just that little bit more glamorous than your ordinary life. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to bring the McLaren GT back to the UK to figure out what the car was like in ordinary surroundings, in places where mere mortals are likely to drive this thing, and in the country where this car is actually built. So I've got one with me right now, a McLaren GT in the UK, and today's the day we find out what this car's actually like in the real world.
First things first, there's no denying that wherever you drive the McLaren GT, people will notice. It's a sensational looking car that draws attention everywhere. Sat amongst the plethora of mini SUVs and hatchbacks, it stands out like a sore thumb, whether that be on your local high street, car park, or outside a cake shop. It just looks the business. It's not the most aggressive looking McLaren out there. It doesn't have the crazy headlight design of the 720S or the see-through doors of the Senna, but it still has a presence. And that's important because if you buy a Grand Tourer, you're gonna want people to appreciate the looks as much as they appreciate the engine that powers it.
A lot of GT cars have the same basic formula. They're front-engined, rear-wheel drive, but the McLaren GT is completely different. It's basically a mid-engine supercar. The engine sits right there behind my head. It's a 4-litre twin-turbocharged V8 that makes 612 horsepower and 630 newton meters of torque. So very powerful, but it isn't like your typical V8. It doesn't sound like a traditional 8-cylinder. It doesn't have that recognizable burble that you might expect from a muscle car. This sounds much more like a V6. I'm not saying it sounds bad, quite the opposite in fact. Because the engine's basically inside the cabin with you, you get to hear a lot of its personality. And one of my favorite bits is the fact that you get to hear a lot of the whooshing from the turbos, which you don't often get in Bentley Continental GTs and cars of that ilk. Performance is really impressive. I'll give you the numbers. 0 to 62 in 3.2 seconds, 0 to 124 in 9 seconds, top speed 203 miles an hour, although it doesn't always feel massively quick. For example, when you're cruising along at say 40 miles an hour, 5th gear, 1500 RPM and you floor it, you've got to wait a little while for the engine to wind up, for the gears to kick down, and for the car to get into the power band. It makes peak torque at around 5,500 RPM, and that's where things start to get really serious. But that's a good thing because it means that when you're driving the car in manual mode, you kick it down into the gear that you want, floor it, really wring the engine out, and that's where you get most enjoyment. You got to really earn that power. There are two places where you really notice the speed of the McLaren GT. First and foremost, off the line. So you use launch control and it pulls like you wouldn't believe. It's really savage. The other place you really notice the speed of this thing is around 70 miles an hour, where most cars tend to run out of puff. This thing seems to get a second wind. You think to yourself, oh, I'm gonna get a little bit of a break now, but the McLaren GT just keeps on pulling. It is absolutely relentless. One really important thing when you buy an expensive car is that you're going to want to be reminded that you were justified in splashing all of that cash. £160,000 in the case of the McLaren GT. And the good news is that the interior in this car is absolutely fantastic, so you always feel like you're in something special. There are 3 separate trim levels. There's standard, there's pure, and there's luxe. In the standard model, you actually get quite a bit of fake leather. You get fake leather on the steering wheel, fake leather on the headlining, and fake leather in the luggage compartment floor.
The Pioneer trim gives you power seats and real leather, while Luxe gets you higher quality semi-aniline leather, heated seats, and slightly nicer materials. But part of me can't help but be disappointed that you don't get everything as standard. Who wants a McLaren with fake leather?
Whichever one of those you go for, there's really no denying that the actual design and layout of the cabin is really special. I love the fact that it's covered in all these organic shapes, these circles, these teardrop shapes on the speakers. But there's actually a bum shape on the dashboard, for goodness sake. It looks absolutely immense. I love the attention to detail and the craftsmanship in here. When I'm rolling around town, ordinarily, there are two things that I really want from a car. One is a really good stereo system, and the other is a really good infotainment system with lots of nice technology. Now, the stereo in the McLaren GT is pretty good. It's a Bowers & Wilkins unit, and it does sound half decent, but it's not a patch on the system that you get in, say, BMW M8, for example. The infotainment system, meanwhile, is half decent. I wouldn't say it's cutting edge, but it's simple to use. You can wrap your head around it in a matter of minutes because everything's nicely laid out and it's very logical to use. There are shortcut buttons along the bottom row that give you quick access to your navigation, your media, your climate control, your phone, and your general settings. However, they can be a little bit unresponsive sometimes, so you find yourself having to press the button several times before it gives you the setting that you want. One thing that I particularly don't like is the fact that you have these really tiny icons to change some of your settings that you might have to use every single day. For example, to change the temperature up here, you've got to press these tiny buttons, and it's very fiddly, especially when you're driving around town. As for the ride, well, that's a really important factor, especially for a Grand Tourer, and I'm happy to say that the McLaren GT pretty much gets it right. It's not the most comfortable car in the world, but considering it's basically a supercar, it's something that you can drive around every day and not feel like you're being shaken to death. It's a really nicely damped system. I was a little bit worried about what this car will be like driving around town, especially over speed bumps or getting up driveways with a slight incline, but there's nothing to worry about in the McLaren GT. The car comes with an optional nose lift system which raises the front end by several inches to get you over bumps, and you can drive it basically like a normal car. Speaking of bearable journeys, the seats in the McLaren GT aren't the most comfortable in the world. I wouldn't say they're uncomfortable, but if you're crossing continents, then at some stage after the 200th or 300th mile, then you might start to wish you were in a Bentley. Not that you'd be able to drive that far anyway, because the fuel tank is actually quite small, 72 litres. A Bentley Continental GT's fuel tank is around 90 litres. When I fill this car up, I get an estimate that it can travel anywhere from 250 to around 350 miles. And in a proper Grand Tourer, then you're getting an extra 200 miles on top of that. As for practicality, there's a couple of things that you might want to know about, which you only discover when you're driving in the real world. This car uses dihedral doors, which open outwards and upwards. And I found a couple of times, accidentally, that whenever someone parks too close to you, or you park too close to someone else in a narrow space, the doors won't open, and they'll actually trap you inside the car because they need a little bit more room than a normal door for you to get in and out of. There's a decent amount of space in the front storage compartment, and even though the rear luggage space is a stupid shape, it's shaped specifically for golf clubs, you can actually live with it.
What I would say is that the car is slightly lacking in refinement. It's not as quiet as a Bentley Continental GT. You definitely hear the road. This isn't a car that separates you from the journey. You feel everything, you hear everything. On a high street, that might not be too bad, but on a motorway, that could be a problem because the tire noise, wind noise, engine noise are all things that make a journey less bearable. Where it really excels is with the handling. The mid-engine layout provides almost perfect balance. It tackles corners with absolute effortless ease and is probably far more enjoyable to drive than anything else in its class.
It really is an engaging car to drive, the McLaren GT. Far more engaging than some of its rivals. The steering in particular is superb. McLaren are one of the few manufacturers that have said, no, we're not going to go down the route of using EPAS, electronic power assisted steering, and it really pays off. They've stuck with hydraulic steering, and the result of that is you end up with a car with so much more steering feel. You know exactly what the front end is doing at any given moment. You know that when you turn in and you start to lose grip, that you're going to feel it, and as a result you can drive this car with a hell of a lot more confidence than you can with some of its rivals. Ultimately, the steering just helps the McLaren GT feel like a really good sports car, and that's a good way of summing this thing up. It's not a GT in the traditional sense. I could happily cross continents in this thing, but would I really want to? Probably not. I think what I'd rather do is cross continents in a Bentley Continental GT, but then when I get to my destination, I'd get out and then I'd jump into a McLaren GT and then really enjoy the nice roads at my destination. As for the question, does the McLaren GT work in the UK? Absolutely. Originally I thought that it might not feel as special as when you're driving around somewhere like the south of France, but if anything, being sat in this cockpit, knowing what it looks like on the outside, and seeing the plethora of Nissan Qashqais and Ford Pumas and you name it, crossovers galore. If anything, I'd say that this thing actually feels more special than I imagined driving around in the UK. If you're lucky enough to be able to afford one, or ever get the chance to drive one of these things, regardless of what country it's in, you're gonna absolutely love it.